Briar Ashdown was still on her knees, scrubbing the nursery floorboards, when the head steward called her the pack's biggest disappointment for the third time that week, and she was still holding the brush, soap dripping down her wrist, when the twin Pups' screaming stopped cold for the first time in 6 days. Unclaimed, unscented, unwanted, Steward Halloway had been saying, pacing behind her with his hands clasped at his back like a man delivering a sentence rather than an insult. Do you know what the other maids call you, girl? The Hollow Omega. Because there's nothing in you a wolf would want. No scent to speak of. No warmth. It's a wonder the Alpha King keeps you in this castle at all instead of putting you out with the kitchen scraps. Briar had learned, over 6 years of scrubbing floors in Ashenmore Keep, that the fastest way through an insult was silence. She kept scrubbing. She did not look up. She had long since stopped waiting for anyone in this castle to see her as anything other than the girl nobody's wolf had ever wanted to claim. An Omega whose scent, according to every nose in the pack, simply wasn't there. No sweetness. No spice. No thread of pheromone for another wolf to follow home. Just a blank space where a person should have been. It had cost her every suitor she might have had, every friend who might have lingered. And 3 years ago, it had cost her the position of nursery maid to the young princess before her, reassigned the moment the old Luna decided a scentless Omega was bad luck around a newborn. But that had been before. Before Queen Isolde Blackwood had died bringing the twins into the world, and before every nanny, wet nurse, and noble caretaker the Alpha King had hired since had lasted, at most, 4 days before fleeing the nursery in tears, bite marks on their forearms, and swearing the twin Pups were cursed. It was the screaming that had started it. A screaming that came not from ordinary infant temper, but from something older and sharper. A wolf's instinct sounding an alarm no one else could hear. Elin and Bram Blackwood, 18 months old, had not slept a full night since their mother's death. They shifted involuntarily in their cradles, tiny paws too clumsy to control, howling with a grief too large for bodies that small. Physicians had examined them and found nothing wrong. Pack elders had murmured about early trauma. The court whispered more quietly about a curse, that the twins had inherited something broken from the manner of their mother's death. An unnatural death that no one but the king seemed to believe was unnatural at all. Briar had only been sent to scrub the nursery floor because no other maid would set foot in the room. She had not intended to interrupt anything. She had not intended, 6 minutes into Halloway's lecture, to start humming. It was not even a conscious choice. The tune came from somewhere so deep in her that she'd stopped questioning it years ago. A lullaby her grandmother used to hum over the hearth on the coldest nights. Wordless, low, more breath than melody. The kind of thing that lived in bones rather than memory. She hummed it now, simply because Halloway's voice was grating and the floor was filthy, and the tune gave her hands something to move to besides fury. The twins, who had been shrieking loud enough to rattle the nursery windows only minutes before, went utterly silent. Halloway noticed the quiet before he noticed Briar had caused it. He turned toward the cradles with the wary look of a man checking whether a storm had simply paused to gather strength. Instead, he found both pups standing at the bars of their carved oak cradle, tiny hands wrapped around the wood, eyes, one pair amber, one pair a startling storm gray, fixed entirely on the scentless maid still on her knees, with a soap-slicked brush in her hand. "Keep humming," Halloway said, in a voice that had lost every trace of contempt. Briar kept humming. Bram, the gray-eyed twin, made a small sound low in his throat. Not a cry. A cheer-up. The sound wolf pups made toward their mother. Aelin toddled sideways, gripping the cradle rail, and reached one small hand toward Briar through the bars, opening and closing her fist the way infants do when they want to be held. It was in that exact moment, Briar frozen on her knees, Halloway staring as though the sky had changed color, the twins reaching for a maid, the whole castle called hollow, that the nursery door opened, and Alpha King Thorn Blackwood walked in expecting, as he had for 6 days running, to find his children screaming and another nurse gone. He was not a man given to visible surprise. 3 years on the throne after his father's death, 2 of them spent burying a mate and ruling a fractured kingdom at the same time, had trained the surprise out of him the way frost trains the color out of a field. But he stopped in the doorway, one hand still on the frame, and looked at the silence in the room, the way a starving man looks at bread he doesn't yet trust is real. "What," he said quietly, "did you do?" Briar rose too fast, dropped the brush, and nearly overturned the bucket of gray water in her scramble to bow. "Your Majesty, I was only cleaning. I didn't mean to disturb the young lord and lady. I'll go." "Don't." The word came out sharper than he intended, and he saw the flinch it put through her, and gentled his voice on the next one. "Don't go. Come here." She approached the cradle on legs that did not feel entirely her own. Up close, the king smelled of wood smoke and cold iron and something older beneath it, something that made the Omega instinct she'd spent her whole life burying want to bare her throat. An instinct she crushed immediately, because hollow Omegas did not get to have instincts like that, not toward Alpha Kings, not toward anyone. She kept her eyes on the twins instead. Bram had climbed half over the cradle rail toward her, wobbling, and she caught him on reflex before he could topple onto the floor. He settled against her shoulder like he'd been doing it every night of his life, and gave a long, shuddering sigh, the kind of sigh Briar recognized from her own body on nights she finally stopped crying. Elin reached both arms up next, silently demanding the same treatment, and Briar, a maid who had never so much as been permitted to hold the young lord and lady before today, who technically had no right to touch royal children at all, looked helplessly at the king for permission she was too frightened to ask for aloud. Thorn nodded once. "Take her too." For the first time in 6 days, both Blackwood twins fell asleep within the hour, tucked against a scentless Omega maid on the nursery floor, while the king of Ashenmore Keep stood over them with an expression none of his advisors would have recognized. Not grief, not the careful blankness he wore in council, but something raw and cautiously, dangerously hopeful. He asked her name. She told him. He asked how long she'd served in the castle. 6 years, she said, mostly in the kitchens and the laundry, never anywhere important. He asked very quietly whether anyone had ever told her what she smelled like. "Nothing, Your Majesty," Briar said, because it was the truth everyone had always given her. "I smell like nothing at all." Something crossed his face too quickly for her to read. Recognition, maybe, or the shadow of a memory. But he only said, "That's not quite right," before excusing himself to attend a council session that could not wait, leaving orders that the hollow Omega was to remain in the nursery until further notice. Word of what had happened moved through Ashenmore Keep faster than any royal decree. By evening, half the castle staff had heard some version of the story, the scentless maid who'd silenced the cursed twins with nothing but a hum, and most of them didn't believe it. Halloway, to his credit, told the tale accurately, though even he couldn't help adding a note of superstitious unease, as if Briar had performed some small, unsettling magic, rather than simply hummed a lullaby. It reached the ears of Lord Edric Colston, the king's regent chancellor, before supper. Edric had run the treasury and half the kingdom's affairs since Isolde's death, first as a grieving king's trusted uncle by marriage and steward, then, gradually, as something closer to a second throne, a position he had built with careful patience over 18 months of Thorn's distraction and grief. He listened to the report from his steward, with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, and his expression perfectly mild. The same mild expression he wore while quietly rerouting pack tariffs into accounts no auditor had thought to check. The same mild expression he'd worn the night Queen Isolde had cornered him in the treasury archive with a ledger in her hand and a question in her eyes that she never lived long enough to ask aloud to anyone else. "A scentless kitchen maid," Edric repeated, turning a signet ring slowly on his finger. Calming the twins. "The whole nursery wing heard it, my lord. They say the young lord and lady slept the full night through, Edric did not visibly react. Internally, something old and cold and long dormant lifted its head. He had spent years making certain that a particular bloodline, a line of Omegas whose blood the old pack laws called Hearthkin, whose very scent and touch could unravel the binding compulsions woven into certain old treasury seals and alpha-forged contracts, had been hunted to extinction 2 generations ago, quietly, thoroughly, without a single surviving record. He had personally overseen the burning of the last known genealogy scrolls in the Western Archive 11 years prior, an act he'd told himself was simple pack housekeeping, tidying loose threads from a civil war that predated him. A scentless Omega who could silence alpha-blooded children with nothing but a hum was, by definition, not scentless at all. She was suppressed, and suppression like that did not happen by accident. "Find out everything about this girl," Edric told his steward. "Where she came from, who her mother was, her grandmother. I want it on my desk within the week." He said nothing about why. He rarely did. It was, he had learned, one of the great advantages of being underestimated by an entire kingdom for 18 years. Nobody thought to ask a mild, tired-looking regent what he was hunting until it was already caught. That night, for the first time in her 6 years at Ashenmore Keep, Briar Ashdown was given a proper room near the royal nursery instead of the servants' dormitory, and a note delivered by a page informed her, in the king's own hand, that her wages had been tripled and her duties reassigned effective immediately. She was to remain with the young lord and lady until further notice, at his personal request. She sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed that night, in a room warmer and finer than anything she'd slept in since her grandmother's cottage burned down when she was 12, and pulled from beneath her collar the one thing she owned that had survived that fire. A small tarnished pendant, its surface worn nearly smooth, engraved with a rune she had never been able to identify, and had never dared show to anyone in the castle, not since a nosy steward had once called it witchwork and threatened to report her for it. She did not know why the twins had gone still at the sound of her humming. She did not know why animals in the castle stables had always gone quiet and watchful around her, ears pricked, never approaching but never fleeing either. She did not know why her grandmother had made her drink a bitter tea of dried silverthorn every night without fail, from the time she was old enough to hold a cup, insisting it was for her health, and had gone pale with something like fear the one time young Briar had refused it. She only knew that for 1 hour that afternoon, in a nursery full of grief no physician could heal, she had not been hollow at all. And somewhere in Ashenmore Keep, in a chamber lined with ledgers, only he was permitted to touch, Lord Edric Colston was already writing the first of several letters that would, within the month, put Briar Ashdown's life in more danger than she had ever imagined a scentless maid's life could be. Ashenmore Keep at night was a different castle than the one Briar scrubbed floors in by day. The torches along the servants' corridor burned lower after midnight, tended by pages too sleepy to trim the wicks properly, and the whole stone weight of the place seemed to settle and creak the way old wolves settle into their joints before sleep. Briar had walked these halls at every hour for 6 years, and had never once felt watched in them. Not until tonight, lying awake in a bed too soft for a girl used to servants' palates, listening to a castle that suddenly felt full of eyes she couldn't name. She thought about the twins' small hands gripping her sleeve. She thought about the way Halloway's contempt had curdled into something almost like fear by the time she'd left the nursery. She thought most of all about the particular stillness that had crossed the king's face when Elin reached for her through the cradle bars. A stillness she recognized now, replaying it in the dark, as the exact same look her grandmother used to wear whenever a traveling merchant lingered too long near their cottage, or asked too many idle questions about where Briar's mother had come from before she settled on the northern border. Her grandmother had never explained that look. She had only ever pulled Briar closer on those evenings, brewed the bitter Silverthorn tea a little stronger than usual, and hummed the same wordless lullaby until whatever danger she sensed had passed. Briar had grown up assuming the caution was simply the ordinary wariness of a woman raising a fatherless, motherless girl, alone at the edge of pack territory. She was beginning, for the first time in her life, to wonder if it had been something far more specific than that. She fell asleep still wearing the pendant, unaware that across the castle, the Alpha King had not gone to bed at all, that he was standing instead at his study window with an old portrait of his dead wife turned face down on the desk behind him, staring out at the dark, wondering for the first time in 18 months whether the woman who'd finally silenced his children's grief might also, somehow, be connected to the question that had haunted him every night since Isolde died, whether her death had truly been the accident the physicians called it, or whether someone within these very walls had made certain a queen who asked too many questions never lived to finish asking them. 3 weeks into Briar's new position, the nursery of Ashenmore Keep had become the only room in the castle where the Alpha King reliably smiled. It was a small thing, the smiling. Thorn Blackwood had perfected. Over 18 months of ruling a grieving pack, the art of appearing composed in every room that mattered. Council chambers, treaty negotiations, the great hall during formal audiences. But composed was not the same as at peace, and it was only in the nursery, watching Briar coax his son into eating vegetables by pretending the spoon was a small growling wolf, or humming the twins down for their afternoon rest with that same wordless lullaby, that something in his chest loosened enough to let an actual smile through. He told himself, in the beginning, that he visited so often purely out of paternal relief. It was easy to believe. For the first time since Isolde's death, Aelin and Bram slept through the night. They ate. They laughed. Actual, unrestrained infant laughter, the kind that had gone out of the nursery the day their mother did. Physicians who had once murmured about curses now murmured instead about the mysterious, calming presence of the new nursery maid, unable to explain in any medical terms why a woman with, by every account, no detectable scent at all, should have such an effect on alpha-blooded children whose instincts responded almost entirely to scent. Briar herself had no explanation to offer them. She only knew that the twins had taken to falling asleep with fistfuls of her sleeve in their small hands, that Bram had started following her from room to room on unsteady toddler legs the moment he could stand unsupported, and that Aelin had begun, in the last week, saying a word that sounded unmistakably like an attempt at Briar, a fact that had made Thorn go very still and very quiet when he first heard it, for reasons Briar did not yet understand. What she did understand, because it was impossible not to, was that she was starting to feel something dangerous every time the king lingered in the nursery doorway a little longer than necessary. She fought it the way she fought every inconvenient feeling, by working harder, staying busier, filling every hour with some task that left no room for hoping. It did not entirely work. There was a particular evening, roughly 3 weeks in, when Thorn stayed past the twins' bedtime to help her fold the small mountain of freshly laundered infant linens, an act so far beneath an Alpha King's dignity that she'd protested twice before he simply ignored her and kept folding, badly, with the focused determination of a man who had clearly never folded anything in his life and refused to admit it. "You don't have to do that, Your Majesty." "I know." He folded a tiny shirt into something resembling a crumpled ball and set it, with evident pride, on top of the pile. "I want to." "Why?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice had dropped into something rougher, more honest than the careful diplomatic register he used in every other room of the castle. "Because for 18 months this room has felt like a wound I couldn't close. And you walked in with a soap brush and closed it in an afternoon, and I don't..." He stopped, exhaled, tried again. "I don't know what to do with how grateful I am. It comes out sideways, apparently as terrible laundry folding." Briar's throat had gone tight, in a way that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with a longing she had no right to. "You don't need to be grateful to me, Your Majesty. I only hummed a tune." "Thorn," he said. "When we're in this room, you can call me Thorn." She should have refused. An Omega Maid did not call an Alpha King by his given name, Not even in private. Not even in a room full of sleeping infants who had somehow decided she belonged to them. But something about the way he said it, quiet, almost pleading. A man asking to be allowed one small ordinary thing after 2 years without any, made her nod instead. It was in the weeks that followed that Briar began, slowly and without quite meaning to, learning the shape of the man beneath the crown. She learned that Thorn Blackwood had never wanted to be Alpha King at all, that his older brother had held the title first, and died in a border skirmish with the neighboring Calder pack 6 years ago, thrusting the throne onto a second son who'd spent his childhood assuming he'd live and die a border captain. She learned that his marriage to Isolde had been an arranged alliance between 2 struggling packs rather than a mate bond, a fact he told her with visible discomfort, as though confessing something shameful, though Briar privately thought there was nothing shameful in 2 people building a genuine friendship and partnership out of a marriage neither had chosen, which was, from everything he described, exactly what they had done. He grieved Isolde as a friend and co-parent and ally. He had never claimed to grieve her as a fated mate, because there had never been a bond between them to grieve. There was an evening, closer to the end of the second week than the beginning, when Thorn arrived at the nursery still dressed in the heavy formal coat he wore for foreign trade envoys, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, and simply sat on the floor beside her without a word, as though the crown on his head weighed less the moment he crossed the nursery threshold. Briar, without thinking about the impropriety of it, handed him Bram to hold while she finished settling Elin, and watched something in the king's shoulders unknot as his son settled trustingly against his chest. The envoys wanted to discuss grain tariffs for 3 hours, he said eventually, staring at the ceiling. I don't think I absorbed a word of it. I kept thinking about whether Bram had finished his afternoon nap. That's not a very kingly thing to admit. No, he agreed. It isn't. You're the only person in this castle I'd admit it to. He glanced at her sideways, something wry and unguarded in his expression that she was coming to recognize as rare, a version of him the council chamber never saw. Halloway still hasn't apologized to you, has he? For what he said, that first day. Briar had almost forgotten Thorn had been present for the tail end of that particular humiliation. It doesn't matter, Your Majesty. Thorn, he corrected automatically, then added more seriously, it matters to me. 6 years in my household, and the closest thing to recognition you've received is an insult delivered while you scrubbed a floor on your knees. That's not a mistake I intend to leave uncorrected. He learned in turn that Briar had grown up in a cottage on the pack's far northern border, with a grandmother who raised her alone after her parents died of a fever when Briar was 4, that the cottage had burned down when she was 12 under circumstances the pack investigators had ruled accidental, that she'd walked 3 days to Ashenmore Keep afterward because it was the nearest place a homeless Omega child could find work, and that she had spent every year since being told, in one form or another, that there was something missing in her. No scent, no warmth, no place in the pack's careful hierarchy of who belonged to whom. There's nothing missing in you, Thorn told her one evening, with a directness that startled them both. There's something in you nobody in this castle has bothered to understand. She didn't tell him about the pendant. Not yet. Something in her, some old instinct inherited alongside the Silverthorn tea and the wordless lullaby, kept her hand pressed flat against her collarbone whenever the subject of her strangeness came too close to the surface, as though the metal beneath the fabric might burn her the moment she spoke its secret aloud. She did, however, begin noticing things she hadn't before. Small oddities she'd spent years dismissing as her own peculiarity rather than evidence of anything larger. The way every dog and barn cat and half-feral packhound in the castle went still and watchful whenever she passed, never approaching, never fleeing, simply watching with an attention that felt less like animal curiosity and more like animal deference. The way her grandmother's old lullaby hummed idly while she worked, made even fully grown alpha guards standing sentry duty in the corridor visibly relax their shoulders, unaware they'd done it. The way Lord Edric Colston, whom she had encountered perhaps 4 times in 6 years prior to the nursery incident, now seemed to find frequent, faintly excessive reasons to pass through the nursery wing himself. She noticed Edric's steward, a thin, watchful man named Percival Ashby, lingering near the servants' quarters where the castle kept its old employment records that, if anyone bothered to check, would show that Briar's grandmother had arrived at that northern border cottage from somewhere else entirely, somewhere no one in living memory could quite name, sometime before Briar's mother was born. She raised the strangeness of it, once, with the oldest of the nursery guards, a grizzled beta named Corwin, who'd served the Blackwood line for 30 years, and had a reputation for saying exactly what he thought, regardless of rank. He'd only shrugged when she asked why the hounds in the courtyard always went still around her. "My old grandmother used to say there were bloodlines the pack forgot on purpose, because remembering them cost certain people too much," he said, sharpening a blade he didn't need sharpened, not looking at her directly. "Didn't think much of it as a boy. Thinking more of it lately, watching you." He wouldn't say more than that, no matter how she pressed, and the wary way he glanced toward the treasury wing before changing the subject told her more than his silence ever could have. The larger complication, the one Briar could not have anticipated, arrived formally on a Tuesday morning in the shape of a royal carriage bearing the crest of House Calder, the same border pack whose skirmish had killed Thorn's brother 6 years prior, now apparently seeking peace rather than further war, in the person of Lady Seraphine Calder, eldest daughter of Lord Calder, arriving at Ashenmore Keep to formalize a marriage alliance that Lord Edric had been quietly arranging with her father for the better part of a year. Briar heard about it from the nursery maids, before she heard it from anyone official, the way all castle news traveled, in whispers, in the laundry, in the kitchen, breathless and half-true. The king was to remarry, a political match. The Calder pack held the mountain iron mines that fed half the kingdom's forges, and controlled the mountain passes the kingdom's trade caravans depended on, and the treasury, still recovering from the costs of Isolde's funeral rites, and 18 months of a young king's inexperienced rule, desperately needed the alliance the marriage would secure. Briar told herself, scrubbing a nursery floor she no longer technically needed to scrub, that it was none of her business, that an Omega Maid had no claim whatsoever on an Alpha King's marriage decisions, that whatever foolish warmth had grown in her chest over 3 weeks of folded laundry and shared confidences was a luxury she'd never truly been entitled to in the first place. She told herself this right up until the moment Lady Seraphine Calder walked into the nursery unannounced that same afternoon, took one long, assessing look at the maid holding both royal children and said, with a coolness that did not entirely mask the exhaustion underneath it, "So you're the one they're all talking about, the hollow Omega who tamed the little wolves." Her eyes flicked briefly to the twins, then back to Briar with something unreadable. "I'm told the king visits this room more than any other in the castle these days. I wonder why that is." It was not spoken as a threat, exactly, but it landed like one, and Briar, holding a sleeping infant prince against her shoulder, in a room that suddenly felt far too small for the 3 adults now standing in it, understood, with sudden and total clarity, that whatever careful private warmth had been growing between herself and the Alpha King was about to collide, very publicly, with the political machinery of an entire kingdom. That collision arrived faster than she expected. Within the week, Lord Edric had summoned Briar to the Treasury wing under the pretext of clarifying her household records. A summons that, on its surface, was routine paperwork, and that beneath the surface, Briar sensed immediately was nothing of the kind. Edric's study smelled of old parchment and colder ambition, and he did not look up from his ledger when she entered, letting the silence stretch until it had teeth. "Your grandmother's name," he said finally, "does not appear in any pack registry prior to her arrival at the northern border, 31 years ago. Curious, for a woman who supposedly lived her whole life within our territory." Briar kept her face carefully still, though her pulse had begun hammering. "I couldn't say, my lord. She never spoke of her life before me." "No," Edric agreed, and finally looked up, his mild expression unchanged, his eyes anything but mild. "I imagine she wouldn't have. Tell me, child, do you know what a Hearthkin bloodline is?" The name meant nothing to her, and her blank confusion was, for once, entirely genuine, which seemed disappointingly to satisfy him more than it worried him. He studied her a moment longer, then returned his attention to the ledger, as though she'd already left the room. "You may go," he said. "For now." Briar left the Treasury wing with her hands shaking, and no clear understanding of what she'd just walked through. Only a growing, cold certainty that the Regent's interest in her had nothing to do with household paperwork at all, a certainty that sharpened into real fear 3 days later, when she returned to her chamber after the twins' bedtime to find the drawer where she kept her grandmother's pendant standing open. Its contents undisturbed but unmistakably searched, and a single dried sprig of Silverthorn, the same bitter herb her grandmother had forced her to drink every night of her childhood, left deliberately on top of her pillow. A message from someone who wanted her to know, quite precisely, that they knew exactly what she was long before she did. Briar did not sleep that night. She sat on the floor of her chamber with the pendant clenched in her fist and the sprig of Silverthorn on the table where she could watch it, as though it might move if she looked away, and turned Lord Edric's question over and over until it wore a groove in her mind. "Do you know what a Hearthkin bloodline is?" She went looking for the answer, the only way a castle maid could. Quietly, carefully, and in the one place she'd learned, over 6 years of scrubbing floors nobody watched her scrub, that the pack's oldest secrets tended to gather dust rather than disappear entirely. The lower archive beneath the western tower, where 3 centuries of pack records had been shelved, forgotten, and left to the moths. It took her 4 nights of stolen hours to find anything, and what she found was not a record at all, but the absence of one. A section of shelving, clearly labeled by decade, with a gap running from roughly 40 to 60 years prior, where every volume had simply vanished, the shelf dust disturbed in a way that suggested the removal had been recent rather than ancient. Whoever had taken those records had not done so a generation ago. They had done it within the last decade, carefully, by someone who knew exactly what to erase. The lower archive smelled of mildew and cold stone, and Briar had spent enough silent hours down there by candlelight to know exactly which floorboards creaked and which night guard patrols passed too close to the tower stair. It was on the 4th night, running her fingers along the dust shadow where an entire decade of volumes should have stood, that she found the one thing whoever cleared the shelf had missed: a single loose page, wedged behind the shelf's back panel, as though it had slipped free during a hurried removal and gone unnoticed in the dark. It was a fragment of a birth registry, the ink faded but legible, listing a name she didn't recognize beside a notation in old formal script. Hearthkin line, maternal relocated northern border per Elder Isolt's protection writ. No further explanation. No indication of who had ordered the writ rescinded, or when, or why the rest of the page's companions had vanished from every shelf in the archive. She carried the fragment back to her chamber with her heart in her throat, understanding for the first time that her grandmother's flight to the northern border had not been an accident of circumstance at all, but a deliberate act of protection sanctioned, once, by the pack's own elders. Protection that someone later had worked very hard to make certain no living person remembered had ever existed. It was Lady Seraphine Calder, of all people, who gave Briar the peace that finally made sense of the gap. Briar had expected hostility from the king's intended bride, and had braced for more of it every time their paths crossed in the following weeks. What she found instead, gradually, was something far more complicated. Seraphine was not, it turned out, remotely eager for the marriage everyone assumed she wanted. Briar overheard the truth of it by accident one evening, passing the solar where Seraphine sat alone with a letter from her father, Lord Calder, and did not bother lowering her voice as she read it aloud to herself, bitterly, believing the room empty. Her father had gambled away nearly a third of Calder holdings to Lord Edric Colston over the past 3 years, in debts the Regent had extended with suspicious generosity, and even more suspicious timing, And the marriage to Thorn was not a peace offering between two proud packs at all. It was Edric calling in the debt, using Seraphine as the currency, in exchange for forgiving Lord Calder's obligations and folding Calder's iron mines under terms that would enrich the Regent's own treasury accounts far more than the Crown's. "He needs the king distracted and grateful," Seraphine said aloud. Unaware, Briar stood frozen in the doorway. A new bride, a new alliance, something to keep the court's eyes on a wedding instead of his ledgers. And my father sold me to pay for it like I was one of his hunting hounds. She looked up then, and found Briar watching her, and for a long moment neither woman spoke. Then, unexpectedly, Seraphine laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Go on, tell the whole castle. It hardly matters now." "I'm not going to tell anyone," Briar said. "I'm sorry, my lady. I didn't mean to intrude." Something in Seraphine's face shifted, wary surprise giving way to something more tired and more honest. "You're the first person in this castle who's apologized to me for anything since I arrived. Everyone else just wants to know if I'm going to make a good Luna." She studied Briar for a long moment. "You're not what they say you are either, you know. Hollow. I don't think anyone in this court has bothered to actually look at you." It was the beginning, unlikely as it seemed, of an alliance neither woman had expected to need. Seraphine, it emerged, had access to something Briar did not. Her father's private correspondence with Lord Edric, packed carelessly among her own belongings when she'd left Calder territory. Correspondence that referenced not only the debt arrangement, but a second, older matter. Payments made 11 years prior for the disposal of Northern Archive materials, per the Regent's specific instruction, and a separate, chilling line further down the same ledger page. Northern Cottage. Final resolution. Per same. Briar's cottage had burned down 11 years ago, when she was 12. In an accidental fire, the pack investigators had ruled closed within a week. The two women sat with that ledger page between them for a long time, before either spoke. "He burned it," Briar said finally, very quietly. "My grandmother. My home. He burned all of it because of whatever I am, and everyone called it an accident." "I don't know what a Hearthkin bloodline is," Seraphine admitted. "But I know men like Edric Colston don't spend that kind of money erasing something that doesn't frighten them." It was Seraphine, working from fragments of old Calder family histories her own grandmother had once told her as bedtime stories. Border packs kept different oral traditions than the Crown Court, stories the capital had long since let fade, who finally supplied the missing piece. 2 generations ago, before the last Great Pack Civil War, there had existed a line of Omega healers known as the Hearthkin, whose blood carried an old, rare gift. The ability to calm even feral, wounded, or alpha-compelled wolves with nothing more than touch or voice, an ability the pack elders of that era had considered sacred. But Hearthkin blood carried a second, less celebrated property. It could unravel certain old blood magic bindings, including the alpha compulsion seals nobles once used to force loyalty oaths and treasury pledges from unwilling stewards. When the Civil War ended in a purge of any bloodline that threatened the new nobility's grip on power, the Hearthkin had been hunted nearly to extinction, their surviving descendants driven into hiding, their scent markers suppressed generation after generation with Silverthorn, the same bitter herb Briar had been forced to drink every night of her childhood, without ever being told why. "Your grandmother wasn't protecting you from an old fairy tale," Seraphine said. "She was protecting you from exactly the kind of man Edric Colston has become." The reason for Edric's fear crystallized with sickening speed once Briar understood what to look for. She remembered then, something she'd overheard months before the twins were even born, back when she still scrubbed floors far beneath a regent's notice. A conversation between 2 treasury clerks about sealed accounts that no auditor could open without the regent's personal signature. Accounts bound, they'd whispered, by the old compulsion work, a phrase she'd dismissed at the time as court superstition. She understood it now as exactly what it was. Edric had spent years funneling pack funds into personal accounts locked behind old alpha compulsion seals, the same category of binding a Hearthkin's blood could unravel on contact. A scentless maid humming lullabies in a nursery was, to nearly everyone in Ashenmore Keep, a heartwarming curiosity. To Lord Edric Colston, she was a living key to every crime he'd spent a decade concealing. And Queen Isolde, Briar realized with a cold lurch, had very likely discovered some version of the same truth. Not about Hearthkin bloodlines specifically, but about the sealed accounts themselves, the missing funds, the pattern of debts Edric had been quietly engineering across half the kingdom's noble houses. Isolde had been clever and careful, and by every account Thorn had given Briar, deeply protective of a treasury she considered her responsibility as Luna. A queen who started asking pointed questions about sealed accounts. 6 weeks before her death was ruled an unfortunate complication of childbirth by a physician whose own gambling debts, Seraphine's ledger fragment now revealed, had also been quietly forgiven by the Regent around that same time. It was too much to carry alone, and not nearly enough to prove to anyone who mattered. A burned cottage, a suggestive ledger line, an oral tradition about a bloodline the Crown Court had officially forgotten existed. Briar knew, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent her whole life being disbelieved, exactly how such evidence would sound, coming from a hollow Omega Maid accusing the second most powerful man in the kingdom of murder and embezzlement. She would be dismissed, discredited, quietly removed from the nursery, and possibly, given what had already happened to her grandmother, removed from the kingdom entirely, in the same manner Edric had removed every other inconvenient loose end. She told Thorn everything 3 nights later, in the nursery, after the twins had finally fallen asleep, her voice shaking through every sentence, and her hand never leaving the pendant at her throat. She had expected disbelief, or at best cautious skepticism. What she got instead was a stillness in Thorn's face that frightened her more than anger would have. The stillness of a man finally hearing confirmation of something he had suspected in his bones for 18 months, and never allowed himself to say aloud, because saying it aloud, without proof, against his own uncle and regent, would have torn the kingdom apart on nothing but grief and suspicion. Isolde asked me, a week before she died, whether I trusted Edric completely, Thorn said, very quietly. I told her of course I did. He'd served my father for 20 years. I thought she was overtired, imagining conspiracies in her last weeks of pregnancy. His jaw tightened. She wasn't imagining anything, was she? I don't know for certain, Briar said. I only know what the ledger fragment says, and what my grandmother spent her whole life hiding, and that someone searched my room and left Silverthorn on my pillow like a warning. Thorn was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rough in a way she hadn't heard from him before, not even in his worst grief. I let him plan my wedding, Briar. I let him manage the treasury he was bleeding dry. I let him counsel me on trade routes with Calder while he was extorting the man's daughter into my bed. And I let him stand at Isolde's funeral and grieve her publicly while... He stopped, breathing hard, and pressed the heel of his hand briefly against his eyes. 18 months. I trusted him for 18 months while he made a fool of my grief. You couldn't have known. I should have asked harder questions the moment she raised her own. He looked at her then, and whatever composure he usually wore in every room, but this one had gone entirely. I'm not going to make that mistake with you. Whatever it takes to prove this properly, whatever it costs, we do it together. You don't carry this alone the way your grandmother had to. Then we get certain, Thorn said, quietly, before he realizes how much we already know. The quiet did not last. 2 days later, Edric requested, with the particular, unhurried courtesy of a man who already believed he'd won, a formal audience with the king to discuss accelerating the Calder wedding timeline, given certain instabilities recently observed among the castle staff. He meant Briar. Everyone in the room understood he meant Briar, including Seraphine, who sat rigid through the entire audience with her jaw set and her eyes on the ledger fragment she'd hidden inside her own sleeve, ready to produce if the moment demanded it. It was Edric's closing remark, delivered with a small, almost fond smile directed at Briar across the council chamber, that turned the entire confrontation. "It's remarkable," he said, "how a scentless nobody manages to find her way into the center of every crisis this family has faced in the last 2 years. Almost as though it isn't chance at all. Almost as though the girl is exactly what her grandmother's cottage fire was meant to prevent from ever growing up." The room went silent. Thorn's hand, resting on the arm of his chair, curled slowly into a fist. Briar felt every eye in the chamber turn toward her, and understood, with her heart hammering against her ribs, that Edric had just made his first true mistake. He had said, in front of witnesses, in front of the king, in front of Seraphine and half the royal council, something only the man who ordered that fire could possibly have known to say. "How?" Thorn asked, in a voice gone dangerously soft. "Do you know about a cottage fire on the northern border that occurred 11 years before this woman ever set foot in this castle?" For the first time in 18 months of careful, mild-mannered control, Lord Edric Colston's composure cracked, not into panic, but into something colder and more calculating, a man recalculating the board in real time. "A regent hears many things, Your Majesty," he said smoothly, already retreating. "I make it my business to know the histories of those who serve this house." But the crack had shown, and everyone in the chamber had seen it. And Briar, standing perfectly still at the center of a confrontation she'd never asked to be part of, understood that whatever quiet, careful investigation she and Seraphine and Thorn had hoped to conduct in secret had just become a race, with Edric now fully aware that his enemies knew far more than he'd assumed, and with the entire weight of a kingdom's stability balanced on how quickly they could prove, in front of witnesses who could not later be silenced, exactly what a mild-mannered regent had spent a decade burying beneath ledgers, Silverthorn ash, and a queen's unmarked grave. Edric moved against them within 2 days, which told Briar, more than anything else could have, exactly how frightened he truly was. It began with an accusation delivered to the full pack council before Thorn could bring any evidence forward himself. Edric, standing with the calm authority of 18 months practiced regency, declaring that the castle had uncovered a grave threat to the royal line. A maid of unknown, unregistered lineage, bearing an unnatural and unexplained influence over the young lord and lady, whose sudden closeness to the king had coincided suspiciously with a series of destabilizing rumors about the crown's finances. He did not accuse Briar of murder or theft directly. He was too careful for that. He accused her instead of something almost worse in the eyes of a nervous, tradition-bound court, of being an unknown quantity, unvetted and unclaimed, exercising unexplained power over alpha-blooded heirs. And he called for her immediate removal from the nursery, and a full pack inquiry into her bloodline before the wedding to Lady Seraphine. A wedding he now pushed to move forward within the week, for the stability of the realm. It was, Briar realized as she stood before the assembled council for the second time in as many weeks, a masterstroke of misdirection. He was using the very truth they'd been trying to expose him with, her hidden bloodline, and inverting it into a weapon against her, painting the ancient gift her grandmother died protecting as a dangerous unknown that the court should fear rather than defend. "If the girl's lineage is truly unknown," Edric said, spreading his hands with theatrical reasonableness, "then surely the responsible course, for the safety of the twin heirs, is a full and public inquiry. Let the pack elders examine her. Let the truth, whatever it is, be established openly, rather than allowed to fester in whispers and rumor." He believed, Briar understood, that a public inquiry favored him, that an old blood oracle ritual, rarely used and half forgotten by most of the modern court, would either fail to identify anything at all, discrediting her further, or would identify her as Hearthkin, and let him argue, in front of witnesses primed by his own rumors, that an ancient and unregulated bloodline posed exactly the kind of destabilizing threat that justified her removal, perhaps permanently, before she could unravel anything further. He had not counted on Thorn agreeing immediately, publicly, and without hesitation. "A full and public inquiry," Thorn said, rising from his seat, "is an excellent idea, Lord Regent. Let us hold it tomorrow in the Great Hall before the full pack. Let us also," he added, before Edric could respond, "invite Lady Seraphine Calder to address the council regarding certain correspondence recently come into her possession, and summon the Treasury auditors to review the sealed accounts under discussion in that same correspondence. If we are committed to establishing the truth openly, Lord Regent, I imagine you'll agree we should establish all of it." The Great Hall of Ashenmore Keep, the following evening, was packed to its ancient rafters. Pack elders, nobles, castle staff, half the kitchen and laundry workers who had spent 6 years calling Briar Hollow now crowded shoulder to shoulder with courtiers to watch the outcome of a confrontation the entire castle had spent 2 days speculating about. Briar stood at the center of the floor, Thorn on one side of the dais, Edric on the other with his composure rebuilt into something smooth and unshakable, and the pack's oldest living elder, a blind, centuries-remembered wolf named Mother Isolt, seated between them with a bowl of still water and a single silver blade for the old blood rite no one in the room had witnessed performed in living memory. The ritual itself was simple and old. 3 drops of blood in still water, and a wolf elder's second sight to read what surfaced. Briar's hand did not shake when she offered it, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she suspected half the wolves in the room could hear it. The water did not merely ripple. It glowed. A faint, warm, gold-threaded light spreading from the 3 drops of blood outward across the bowl's surface. A color Mother Isolt identified, in a voice gone reverent with genuine shock, as the unmistakable signature of Hearthkin blood, a bloodline she herself had believed extinct for 2 generations, lost, she said, in the purges following the old Civil War. Purges she had always privately suspected were less about pack safety and more about certain ambitious nobles' fear of a bloodline that could unmake compulsion oaths at a touch. A murmur ran through the great hall, awe tangled with old superstitious unease, exactly as Edric had gambled it would. He opened his mouth to press his advantage, to pivot the room's uncertainty into fear, to argue that an unregulated, unprecedented power now stood within arm's reach of the royal heirs and required immediate containment. And it was in that exact window, before he could speak a single word of it, that Seraphine Calder stepped forward with a leather portfolio of her father's private correspondence and read the Treasury auditor's preliminary findings aloud to the full council. Sealed accounts, opened that very afternoon under royal writ, revealed a decade of quietly diverted pack tariffs, forgiven noble debts extended on suspiciously generous terms, and then called in as leverage, and a pattern of payments, including one, dated 11 years prior, for resolution of Northern Archive materials and associated property, that traced with damning specificity back to Lord Edric Colston's own personal seal. The final piece came from the twins themselves, small and wordless, and utterly undeniable. Thorn had them brought into the hall at Briar's quiet suggestion, and the moment Elin and Bram caught sight of her across the crowded floor, both pups broke free of their attendants and toddled straight through the assembled nobility to reach her, climbing into her arms in front of the entire pack with the unhesitating trust that had eluded every other caretaker for 18 months, a trust that needed no ritual, no ledger, no auditor's report to be understood by every wolf in that hall as exactly what it was. Edric's composure did not shatter so much as fold, quietly. The way a man folds when he finally understands the room has already decided against him, and no amount of eloquence will buy back what's been lost. He did not confess to Isolde's death outright. He was too controlled, even in defeat, to hand them that admission cleanly. But when Mother Isolt, invoking her authority as pack elder, called for the physician who had ruled Isolde's death an unfortunate complication to be summoned and questioned under the same public writ, the physician's own nerve broke long before Edric's did, and the confession that followed, given in trembling detail before the full council, closed the last gap in a truth 18 months in the making. Isolde Blackwood had died not of childbirth complications, but of a slow poison administered over her final weeks, at Lord Edric Colston's arrangement, because she had discovered the sealed accounts and refused, gently and firmly, to let the matter rest. The tribunal that followed was swift, and, at Thorn's insistence, entirely legal rather than personal. Edric was not executed in some private act of royal vengeance, which the old pack laws would technically have permitted a wronged Alpha King to claim. Instead, he was tried before the full council under the same public writ he himself had demanded be used against Briar, stripped of his regency, and every title he had built across 18 months of careful manipulation, bound in silver thread restraints that would prevent him from ever shifting again, and exiled from Ashenmore territory permanently, a sentence Mother Isolt pronounced not as punishment alone, but as testimony, entered into the pack's permanent record, so that no future regent could quietly erase what had been done in this hall, the way Edric had once erased an entire bloodline's history. The physician received a lesser but still severe sentence, his testimony formally preserved as evidence against any noble who might, in future, believe a court physician's silence could be purchased so easily again. Lord Calder's debts, the council ruled, were void, extracted under coercion, and compounded interest structured to be unpayable by design, a judgment that freed both Lord Calder's holdings and, far more importantly to everyone actually standing in that hall, Lady Seraphine Calder herself, whose marriage contract Thorn dissolved publicly, and without hesitation the same evening, at her own request, before the ink on Edric's sentencing had even dried. "I don't want to be Luna of a kingdom I was sold into," Seraphine told Thorn quietly, after the hall had begun to empty. "But I'd very much like to help rebuild a treasury I now understand better than most of your auditors do." Thorn, watching Briar across the room with the twins still asleep in her arms, agreed without hesitation, and appointed Seraphine to head the very financial reforms that would spend the following year dismantling every remaining compulsion seal and sealed account Edric's decade of quiet theft had left scattered through the kingdom's ledgers. Work she would come to do with a rigor and satisfaction no forced marriage could ever have given her, eventually building, alongside a border captain she met during the reforms, a life entirely her own. Halloway, of all people, was the one who came to find Briar the morning after the tribunal, twisting his cap in his hands with none of the imperious contempt he'd once delivered so freely over a scrub brush. "I called you Hollow," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "For years. I want you to know I understand now how wrong that was, and I'd take every word of it back if I could." Briar, who had spent 6 years absorbing his contempt without complaint, because complaint had never once changed anything, found she had no interest in punishing him for it now. "You didn't know what you were looking at, Master Halloway. Almost nobody did. I'm not sure I'd have believed it myself if someone had told me a year ago." "Doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. "But it's done, and I'd rather spend what's ahead of me building something than standing in the wreckage of what people used to say. If you want to make it right, there's a nursery full of children who could use a steward who's learned what patience looks like." He took the offer as the mercy it was, and became, in the months that followed, one of the gentlest hands the nursery staff had ever known. Proof, Briar thought privately, that even the worst assumptions a pack carried about its own people could be unlearned, given the right room to unlearn them in. Mother Isolt's ruling on Briar's bloodline did not end with the tribunal. In the weeks that followed, the pack elders formally repealed the old Civil War-era prohibitions against Hearthkin bloodlines, restoring to pack law a protection that had been quietly, deliberately erased 2 generations before Briar was even born. A decree Thorn signed personally, in the same great hall where the truth had surfaced, declaring that no wolf in Ashenmore territory would ever again be hunted, suppressed, or forced to drink bitter herbs in secret for the crime of a gift their ancestors had once considered sacred. Briar herself no longer needed to hide the pendant. She wore it openly now, the old rune finally identified by Mother Isolt as the ancient Hearthkin ward mark, a symbol of protection rather than warning, exactly as her grandmother had always known it to be. and never had the safety to explain. It was on a quiet evening months later, in the same nursery where this had all begun, that Thorn found her humming the same wordless lullaby over two sleeping pups who called her Bree now instead of nothing at all, and asked her, with none of the careful diplomatic distance he'd once used in every room but this one, whether she would consider becoming something more permanent to this family than a nursery maid. Not for the sake of an alliance, not for the treasury, not for anything the kingdom needed from her, but because the wound in this room had never truly closed until the day she walked into it, and he did not want to spend whatever years remained to him finding out what it felt like to lose that healing twice. Briar, who had spent 6 years being told she smelled like nothing, that she was hollow, that there was no place in this pack's careful hierarchy for a girl no wolf had ever wanted to claim, looked up at the Alpha King of Ashenmore Keep, and for the first time in her life, let herself believe that being wanted had nothing to do with scent at all. "I smelled like nothing to everyone else," she said softly, echoing the words she'd once given him as an apology. "What do I smell like to you?" Thorn crossed the small distance of the nursery floor, knelt beside her the way he had that very first afternoon, and answered the question the only way that had ever truly mattered. "Like home," he said. "Like the first quiet this castle has had in 2 years. Like something I'm never going to let anyone take from this family again." Seraphine visited the following spring, not as a bride returning to unfinished business, but as a friend and reform minister with a border captain's ring on her hand and a genuine laugh Briar had never once heard during her first weeks at Ashenmore. She held the twins on the nursery floor, now 3 years old and considerably more mobile, and told Briar, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who'd finally built a life she chose herself, that dismantling a decade of corrupt ledgers had turned out to be the most enjoyable work she'd ever done. "Turns out I never wanted a crown," she said. "I wanted to matter to something that mattered. Edric just made it very hard to see there was a difference." Briar thought about that conversation often in the years that followed. How close an entire kingdom had come to mistaking one woman's forced silence for consent, and another woman's suppressed bloodline for absence, simply because neither of them had ever been asked, honestly, what they actually wanted. She thought about her grandmother, too, on quiet evenings in the nursery, and hoped, in the way grief eventually softens into gratitude, that some part of the old woman who'd spent a lifetime brewing bitter tea in hiding had known, somehow, that the granddaughter she'd protected would someday get to stop hiding at all. Outside the nursery window, the same castle that had once called her the Hollow Omega had already begun, in whispers that would take years to fully quiet, telling a very different story. Of a scentless maid who was never hollow at all, only waiting, through every Silverthorn night of a childhood spent in hiding, for a room full of grieving pups and one tired, honest king to finally need exactly what she had never stopped carrying.